Okay, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us for this tonight's guest, invited speaker, who is Dr. Alan Dickin, Professor Emeritus of Geology from McMaster University. I will give a short intro of himself, and then we'll enjoy from his talk, which would be a new theories about Noah's flood and Noah's Ark. Professor Dickin did his PhD at the University of Oxford, and he has been since the professor of geological sciences at McMaster University in Ontario, Canada. His books on geological sciences and biblical studies include Radiogenic Isotope Geology, which was published in 1995, and republished in 2005 and 18. And on the biblical studies, he had published a few books. One is Pagan Trinity, Holy Trinity in 2008, a scientific commentary on Genesis 1 to 11, 2015, and From the Stone Age to Abraham, a biblical history of the ancient world. And in 2018 and 2021, he had published two important papers about one about the Noah's flood, coming with a date, potential date for the Noah's flood could happen in Mesopotamia. And 2021, he had published another paper, which was more about science and religion, about the plausibility or the possibility of having an ark to be made with the available tools of that time. So both theories would be, I think, would be influential in the coming years, about both in the biblical, the subject of science and religion, and also biblical studies, and a follow-up would be the Quranic studies too. So we are very excited, Professor Dickin, to have your talk. So if you share your PowerPoint, we will join. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Right, well, thank you for inviting me to speak to you about Noah's flood and Noah's Ark. And I would like to begin by discussing why Noah's flood and Noah's Ark are important for faith in God. So let me see, I was expecting it to scroll down, and okay, yeah. Sorry for a moment. Okay, so I would say that most Jews, Christians, and Muslims recognize Abraham as the father of faith, but maybe not so many believe the Bible's claim that faith in God began long before the time of Abraham. But the book of Genesis says that the worship of God began in the time of Adam, and that it was preserved through the great flood by Noah. So in addition, the New Testament book of Hebrews, that's to say chapter 11, verse 7, says that Noah was a man of faith just like Abraham. And it also says that Noah's faith was shown by his actions. That is to say, by building the ark to survive the flood, that was a demonstration of Noah's faith. But this faith would only be real if the flood itself was real. So in order to explore whether the flood really happened, I want to ask basically three main questions. So the first question is, what was the extent of Noah's flood? So this picture here shows what's probably a very widely held view, certainly in Christian circles, of Noah's Ark as like a giant ship floating on a flood that's probably worldwide, that covered the whole globe. However, this view of a global flood is a big problem scientifically because it contradicts a vast amount of geological evidence. Now, we could spend a lot of time looking at geological evidence that shows that there was no global flood. However, this would perhaps not be very useful for people of faith, because people of faith may frankly overlook scientific evidence if they feel that their faith demands certain beliefs about the Bible, say. So it would be more profitable to discuss how to correctly interpret and understand the Bible than it is to discuss what the evidence might be against a global flood. So that's what I'm going to do to begin with. So I would say that the idea of a global flood is actually a misunderstanding of Hebrew. So the Hebrew word eretz, at least that's my pronunciation of it, the Hebrew eretz can mean both earth and also land. In fact, the translation land is much more common in the Bible. In translations of the flood story, eretz is usually translated earth. For example, Genesis 7:23, which says, every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out by the flood. But this verse could also be translated, every living thing on the face of the land was wiped out by the flood. In this sense, land could have a much more local meaning than the whole earth. For example, it could mean the land of Mesopotamia. So why Mesopotamia? So we need to look at the wider context of Mesopotamia's role in the biblical story. The Bible places most of the early human history in Mesopotamia. So firstly, before the flood, the Garden of Eden was in Mesopotamia, which is to say, it's described as being where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers meet, at the bottom of the seaward end of Mesopotamia. And also, after the flood, the Tower of Babel was built in Mesopotamia. We know that because it specifically says that it was built using bricks and tar rather than stone and cement. So the biblical history before and after the flood is in Mesopotamia, and there's good evidence the flood also is in Mesopotamia. Well, a good reason for that is that Mesopotamia is one of the largest flat areas in the earth. So this is a contour map here, of Mesopotamia, and it shows the ancient courses. I think my mouse would actually work here. The ancient courses of the Tigris and the Euphrates, and it also shows topographic contours. So the lowest in the middle is colored greenish, and then the high ground in the mountains of Iran, which is the Kabir Kur, that's colored kind of purple color. So those are high mountains over 2,000 meters. However, you can see from this map that there's an area of something near 100,000 square kilometers with less than 50 meters of vertical relief. So the 50-meter contour is along this side and along this side here, and Baghdad is up here. Just for kind of comparison, the ziggurat of Great Ziggurat Ur is nearly 50 meters high. So basically, the total topography on the plain of Mesopotamia is less than the height of a ziggurat, essentially. It's extremely flat, and the rivers have very, very low gradients. which makes them very susceptible to flooding. So we can say, in sort of summary, Noah's flood was most likely a catastrophic river flood in Mesopotamia. Now, in Genesis chapter 7, verse 11, it says, on the 17th day of the second month, on that day, all the springs of the great deep were opened. Now, in the ancient world, the new year is the new moon at the equinox. So therefore, the second month is basically May. And so this puts the flood beginning near the end of May. And if we compare that with the chart at the bottom, this is a plot showing the discharge of the rivers, meters of cube per second, against the month of the year. And the top two lines are the peak discharge for the Tigris and the Euphrates, and the bottom two are the average. So you can see that the peak discharge of the Euphrates is near the end of May, and it's basically an order of magnitude higher than the discharge like in the winter. So in other words, flooding in Mesopotamia has been historically very prevalent. Not anymore, because a large number of large dams have been built across the Euphrates, and so these discharge figures no longer apply because the Euphrates no longer floods. Okay, so this is all indicative of the likelihood of disastrous flooding, but another factor which contributes to catastrophic flooding in Mesopotamia is the fact that the rivers typically flow in beds which are elevated relative to the surrounding plain. So you can see that on this cross section to the left. Now, you should note here that the height of this diagram is in meters. The horizontal distances are in kilometers, and so this plot has 200 times vertical exaggeration in order to show in a reasonable space what we want to see. So you can see that, so this represents the river channel, the river itself, and these are the levees which keep the river in its course. But if the river breaches the levees in a flood, then it will flood all of the surrounding low-lying land very quickly. Now, another factor in regards to the from the perspective of an ancient inhabitant of Mesopotamia, we need to understand what it actually felt like to be in Mesopotamia if there was a flood. And as it says here, oh, sorry, I should explain, this is a view looking north from the Great Ziggurat of Ur towards the Persian mountains, but you can't see any mountains in the view. And the reason you can't see them is because of the curvature of the earth. So in this little diagram here shows that these mountains in Iran are about 250 kilometers away, and the curvature of the earth, so even though they're very high mountains, over 4,000 meters, the curvature of the earth means that they're invisible from the center of the plain. In fact, no mountains are visible from the plain. So when it refers in the biblical flood story to the fact that all the mountains were covered by the flood, we have to infer that these were not natural mountains, but that they were artificially built mountains. The reason why this would be particularly significant is that it would be on these artificial mountains that the false deities, the idols, would be worshipped, and it would be this idol worship that would provoke God's judgment, as it's seen in the Bible, of the flood. I should say briefly in connection with this that an event which scientifically appears to have natural causes in Genesis is identified as an act of God. These are not contradictory views, they're just a scientific versus a theological view of the same event. So anyway, to conclude about the answer to this question, a devastating flood in ancient Mesopotamia would appear to cover the whole world that was known at the time. So let's examine the date of the flood. Now, traditionally, one of the strongest constraints for the date of the flood comes from what's called the Sumerian king list. The most complete version of the king list is the so-called Weld-Blundell prism, dating to around 1700 BC. You can see it here on the left. It's, as the name suggests, it's a clay prism. It's about 1 foot high and 4 inches across. It's a square prism, and the cuneiform text on this in the king list places the flood before the first dynasty of Kish, which is around 2900 BC, begins around 2900 BC. So we're going to look now at a summary of the first part of the text. So basically, the king list is in two major parts. It has what we call the antediluvian part, which is to say before the flood, and then it says the flood flooded all the land, and then there are a series of dynasties after the flood, which I've only shown 2 of here because the later ones are relevant here. So the text says that kingship was lowered from heaven, firstly in the city of Eridu, which, as you can see, is on the first, the top of the list. The oldest is at the top here. So the kingship began in Eridu, and then it says there were 4 other cities that ruled basically over Mesopotamia with a bunch of kings, as you can see there. And then the flood swept over Mesopotamia, and then after the flood, kingship recommenced, but in the city of Kish. Then eventually, after 23 kings, it moved to Uruk, and so on, other cities of the plain. And as it says at the bottom there, the beginning of the Kish dynasty has been dated archaeologically. However, there are major problems with this approach to dating the flood, even though it's the most widely used, essentially. The first problem is that the antediluvian section, the first 5 kings there, is not historically attested. Now, it is attested, in fact, that Eridu, the top, was probably the oldest city of the plain. But the other 4 cities there, although they're real cities, they were not important. In fact, during this time, after Eridu, it was Uruk that was the dominant city for at least 500 years, even though it's not even mentioned in the king list. Second major problem is that we now have an earlier version of the king list, which was written around 2100 BC, which is to say it's 400 years earlier than the prism we just saw, which is in Oxford, by the way. This 400 years earlier, older version doesn't have the antediluvian section at all. The suggestion, in other words, in fact, is that the antediluvian section was like a prequel that was added later to make the king list sound more, to give it more gravitas, basically. In fact, the earlier version of the king list doesn't even mention the flood at all. It simply begins with the kingdom of Kish. So we can say that the 2900 BC date is purely a minimum date for the flood. The flood was basically slotted in before the Kish dynasty because, well, they didn't have any idea when it was really, so they just stuck it in there at a convenient spot. But this is absolutely a minimum age for the flood. So let's now look at some archaeological evidence. This is a sort of exploded diagram of a series of temple buildings at the city of Eridu, which we've mentioned already. It's exploded in the sense that these temple structures are all actually one above the other. So the bottom one has been like moved out sideways so that you can see it. The oldest temple at the bottom goes back to around 5000 BC. And essentially what happened was they wanted to build a bigger temple, but they wanted to preserve the sanctity, as it were, of the site. So what they did was they incorporated the foundations of the earlier temple into a platform, and then they built a new temple on top of the platform, and then so on and so on. And as time went by, the platform got larger and higher as the temples got bigger. Basically, the forerunner of the ziggurat. But the important thing is that none of these temples built over a period of, well, basically 2000 years shows any evidence of damage by a flood. So the logical interpretation is the flood was before any of these temples. But there's a lot more evidence for an early date for the flood. One of the most important is the population evidence. So the Bible claims that all ancient peoples, well, of the known world, including, for example, the Greeks, were descended from Noah. However, this belief would only have been credible if the flood was in the distant past to allow the time for, all these descendants to spread out over the known world. And therefore, that the flood would need to be relatively soon after the agricultural revolution. We know from Genesis that Adam was after the agricultural revolution because Cain and Abel are described as like farmers and so on, and shepherds. This map here shows human migration after the agricultural revolution into Europe. And it shows at the bottom there that there was indeed a migration of the Greeks from the Middle East to Greece around 6000 BC. So in other words, the kind of the overall impression of Genesis, of the idea that people spread out over the known world after the flood was actually very credible, but only if the flood was in that same ballpark in the 6th millennium BC. And we have a third completely separate line of evidence about the most likely time of the flood from paleoclimate evidence, which also points to an early flood. So one line of paleoclimate evidence comes from Lake Van, which is in eastern Turkey. Now, a plan of Lake Van is shown on the left there, and in the right, it's situated in Mesopotamia, and you can see that it basically, lies essentially between the headwaters of the Euphrates here and the Tigris here. So going back to the idea of the May flood, as May as being the most typical time for the flood, then the major cause of the flood is snow melt in these mountains of eastern Turkey where these rivers rise. So therefore, you can see that records of precipitation at Lake Van are very relevant to the time when it would be most likely for there to be a flood based on higher precipitation rates. So specifically, Lake Van is what's called a terminal lake. It lies, it sort of nestles in amongst the mountains. It has no outflow. So what that means is that the level of the lake is dependent on a trade-off between input from the rivers flowing into the lake from rainfall and evaporation. Now, at the present day, the level of the lake varies by 1 or 2 meters per year due to like varying rainfall. But you can see in this chart, this is a chart of lake level against time, and you can see that over the last 15,000 years, the level of the lake has changed by over 400 meters. That's nearly 1,500 feet. So that's an enormous change in the level of the lake. And you can see that the steepest increase, which I've marked as wet period, is around 6,000 BC. Now, we know basically the shape of the lake underwater from bathymetry. So we can use this record of lake level to basically calculate the water influx from rainfall, the water inflow against time. So this is like a model of precipitation rates in the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates. Specifically, as I just said, the greatest precipitation rate is at 6,000 BC, and specifically the point that's marked, point X that's marked there, represents a drill core. This data comes from drill cores in the lake floor, and point X is a level in the lake that was flooded for the first time at 6,000 BC as the level started to increase. So this gives us sort of a point of initiation for the period of intense rainfall. Now we have an additional separate line of evidence about paleoclimate from cave stalactites. Now, of course, there are no caves in Mesopotamia, but Mesopotamia is part of the Fertile Crescent, which extends into the Levant, which is to say Israel. And so in the mountains of the Levant around Jerusalem, there are caves, and these record past climate. And this record here shows carbon isotope ratios as a function of time. These are stable carbon isotopes, and they measured in the stalactite, and they tell us what the carbon isotope ratio of the waters were that were feeding into the cave. And this is a climatic indicator. Basically, high delta C13, as they're called, ratios or values in the stalactite indicate what the authors of this paper, that's to say Bar Matthews et al., called a deluge period. They called it a deluge period without actually any, knowledge or consideration that this might be in any way connected with Noah's flood or deluge, but that was their word. They called it a deluge period. And as you can see, the deluge period is 8,000 years ago, which is to say 6,000 BC. And you can also see that these high values are unique in the last 60,000 years. So this is a unique period in human history of intense flooding in the Middle East. And also, you can see that this peak is labeled S1 because severe flooding in this whole region gives rise to what's called a sapropel. It's a kind of a peat layer which is seen in seafloor sediment cores. And this, in fact, is the youngest of several. There, you know, the last million years or so had various glacial cycles, and there were previous values. There are previous times when conditions were similar, like hundreds of thousands of years ago, and we get more of these sapropels. But basically, the sapropel is indicative of a period of flooding when, on the one hand, more organic material was carried to the sea. For example, from the Nile, let's say, there was a greater input of organic material, and also a large input of fresh water broke up the convection pattern in the sea, caused an anoxic layer to form at the bottom of the sea, and that preserved the organic material. So these two factors together are what causes the sapropel. Now, while all this was happening, sea level was rising. So during the last glacial maximum, which is around 20,000 BC, sea level was actually 100 meters below the present day sea level. As the ice melted, sea level rose by about 1 centimeter per year for a period of 10,000 years. So that represents the steep limb of, that represents the steep limb of this graph. But then at 5,000 BC, basically it stopped. In other words, all the ice that could melt had melted, and suddenly sea levels stopped rising. So it was quite a sudden transition from quite a steep increase to no increase. What's the significance of this phenomenon? Well, in order to answer that question, we need to look in some detail at this cross-section. We have another cross-section here. Again, the vertical is in meters and the horizontal is in kilometers. So it's, again, a few hundred times vertical exaggeration. And this is a cross-section of a meandering river. So we have basically here on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side, which is incomplete, but these are two segments of the river that are cut across by the line of section. This is actually one of the rivers coming from Iran, but it flows into the plain of Mesopotamia. Now, as I said, during the last ice age, sea level was 100 meters below the present day. And as a result, these rivers cut gorges down into the older sediments. So if I can make my mouse work, the pale gray here are older sedimentary layers, pre-Holocene, as it says, that basically before the last glacial maximum. And this is the gorge that was cut down into these sediments by the river. I mean, it could go quite a lot deeper. That's as far as the drill cores went. So you can see that during this period, when sea level is still rising, these rivers would not be able to flood the plain because they're confined to their gorges. But as sea level rises, it floods the gorge, and the effect of this is as soon as the river flows into seawater, into stagnant water, it drops all its sediment. So as the gorges fill up with seawater, they very quickly also fill up with sediment. So what happens is, so the gorges gradually fill up through time. And on the right-hand side, I don't know if you can see that because the cameras are maybe obscuring it, but anyway, there's some radiocarbon dates there, which are from like around 6,000 down to 5,500 BC. So what it shows is that between 6,000 and 5,500 BC, sea level is finally coming up to fill up the gorges and obtrude, if that's the right word, onto the level of the plain, which is to say here. So that means that after 6,000 BC, the river, if there's a severe river flood, it will flood now the whole plain. And furthermore, the sea will back it up so that the river will not be able to quickly drain away. The flood will not quickly drain away because sea level has risen. So this is kind of like the perfect storm. Period of intense rainfall and rising sea level occur essentially at the same time to create unique probability of a flood, basically at 5,600 BC. And this is also supported by some drill cores from the city of Uruk. Uruk is one of the oldest cities of southern Mesopotamia, and we have continuous human occupation that goes back to 5,000 BC. That's a radiocarbon date, but in addition, you can see, in these cores, the little dots are pottery sherds, and you can see this here, for example, continuous occupation back until here, and below the earliest occupation level is a peaty layer. So this is the best candidate for Noah's flood. In other words, the peaty layer is basically a sapropel deposited by the flood, and you can see it's in the two right-hand drill cores. It's not present in the left-hand drill core because this is actually where the river itself was at this time. This is the river, these are the river channel. Obviously, you don't get a peat deposit in the river channel because that's where the river is. So you get a peat deposit on the overbank area, which was flooded, where you get the stagnant water lying for months or years, whatever. So this is the best candidate for Noah's flood, as I said, at 5,600 BC. So the conclusion is Noah's flood was in the Neolithic period. It's 2,700 years earlier than it's been widely believed. And of course, in the Neolithic period, only stone tools would have been available to build the ark. This is a stone hand axe, and you can see it looks quite useful for cutting down trees, but not so good for making nice squared off planks. So here's the third question is, could Noah's Ark have been built in the Neolithic period? And the answer is no, not if the Ark looked like this, with its with a giant ship with its neat planking. By the way, this is similar to what was seen in the dreadful movie called The Flood with Russell Crowe, but that's another story. In comparison, if the Ark was built like a wooden cargo ship, it would in fact have been the largest vessel ever to float. This is a picture of the Wyoming, which was the largest wooden cargo ship. It was built around 1908 or something. Even though it was reinforced with steel bracing, it flexed in heavy weather and it sank in a storm. So the idea of the Ark as a wooden cargo ship is basically completely impossible. But on the other hand, what do Mesopotamian sources say about the Ark? Well, there are two major Mesopotamian sources that speak to this. The, as we call them at least, the epics of Gilgamesh and Atrahasis. Now, recently, a small tablet was discovered, which seems to be a sort of excerpt from the Atrahasis epic. this tablet shown on the right, it's a few inches high, which has come to be called the Ark Tablet, gives the most detailed account of the design of the Ark. And in fact, it was only quite recently discovered. If I've got a couple of minutes, I think I should just tell you the story of this tablet. It was bought on the antiquities market in Baghdad during the Second World War and brought back to Britain. And it was by a guy who was in the British forces, who died and passed it on to his son. His son took it into the British Museum for them to have a look at it, but initially refused to part with it. 20 years later, he finally agreed to let them have it or borrow it or whatever, just in time because he died a couple of years later. And it was basically recognized by this British Museum curator, Irving Finkel. He recognized the first line of the tablet as being a very important quote of one of the gods speaking to what we call the flood hero. In other words, the equivalent of in Mesopotamian of Noah. So as I've just noted here, the Ark Tablet begins with instructions from the god of wisdom, who says to Noah, or his Mesopotamian equivalent, tear down your house, build a boat. Now, this seems to imply, these instructions seem to imply that the ark was built from a reed hut, like repurposed for an ark. But the Ark Tablet also says that the ark should be circular in shape and ginormous. In fact, the Ark Tablet specifies that the size of the ark, the area of the ark, was 1 field, or essentially 1 acre. And in fact, that agrees with the other 2 Mesopotamian accounts of the flood, which the Gilgamesh and the Atrahasis epics. And it also agrees with the account in Noah's Ark. All of these 4 versions agree that the ark was about the size of 1 acre. So that's very important. It suggests that this story of the size of the ark, the deck area at least, is not some exaggeration, but quite a reasonable description. So how could this be done? Well, Irving Finkel argued that if the ark was circular, it must basically have been scaled up coracle. So in this photo here, you can see a coracle on the Euphrates River, probably in Iraq. It's about 5 meters across, and it's made as a sort of basket with a frame, sort of like a kind of rope basket. And then it's waterproof with large amounts of pitch, which is widely available in Iraq. So this is, a common design of coracle in Iraq. So Finkel proposed that this was the design of the ark, but he also admitted that a coracle of this size, 70 meters across, that's the size implied by an area of 1 acre. He admitted that a coracle 70 meters across could not actually be built. And this was demonstrated by a TV documentary, which was made with Irving as its principal advisor. So what they attempted to do for this TV documentary was make a replica of the ark. Well, they couldn't make one 70 meters across, so they made a stab at building one that was 20 meters across, which is pretty big. And this is a photo of it. So it's made as a giant coracle. Unfortunately, even though it was tarred with pitch underneath, it leaked very badly, and they only made it float with a high-powered mechanical pump. Clearly, this shows that a giant coracle is unseaworthy. It would definitely not have survived Noah, the biblical story says Noah's Ark was afloat for a year. This clearly would not have floated for a year. So, notwithstanding Irving's claims, it seems he's basically misunderstood the instructions on the Ark Tablet. Now we can get a better idea of what was involved by some 19th century boat building practices in Iraq. This is a drawing of, based on a photograph of what they called the. It was basically described by some British military people who were obviously in Iraq in the 19th century, and they said that these, what they call them arks, these small arks were built from actually very crude logs which were lashed together with palm rope. And you can see the left-hand side one is the base, the floor of the ark, as it were, and the right-hand side shows it with its walls put on. However, the critical part of the construction is that these crude logs tied together, the gaps between the logs are stuffed with palm fiber, and then the whole thing is drenched with molten pitch or tar or whatever. And it's this impregnation with the molten pitch which gives the what should I call it, this boat its strength and its buoyancy. So we can apply this insight to the Ark Tablet, to understanding the Ark Tablet. The Ark Tablet describes a wooden framework for the Ark, which seems to have been made in a very similar way to the 19th century shipyard. So, yes, basically 3,600 cross beams were lashed to 30 main ribs with palm fiber rope. So on the right-hand side there, you can see a plan of a small part of this structure, that basically 4 major ribs, which are vertical. Each of these major ribs is basically the girth, the size of the rib is about a bushel basket. So if you think of a bushel basket, that's the size of the log. They're pretty big logs. And then crossways are smaller logs, which are about half a bushel basket in girth. And this line here is a line of cross section, which is shown above. So here is the main rib underneath, and then we can see the cross pieces here. And this is all lashed together. However, you can see there are large gaps here. So these gaps are caulked with large amounts of palm fiber, which is stuffed in all the holes. And then the whole thing is sealed or glued together with an enormous amount of molten pitch. In fact, the Ark Tablet specifies, in translation, 270 cubic meters of pitch. Well, that's a lot of pitch, but you should remember that near the river at a place called Hit in Iraq, there are natural tar seeps, basically lakes of tar where tar oozes out of the ground, maybe even molten, so that you maybe wouldn't even have to melt it. So they've got vast amounts of pitch available to do this right on hand. And furthermore, if you mix a bit of sand into the pitch, you actually get asphalt, which can make an extremely durable surface, basically a road, like a road. And this, basically a road surface the size of an acre would have made an excellent structure for carrying a large herd of animals, which of course is described in the accounts of the flood. Then this platform would have to then have a reed hut attached to it for the humans to live in. So these reed huts consist of a framework of giant reed bundles, and then as if Noah was following the instructions of the God of wisdom, he would have dismantled his house, and then these giant bundles would have been fixed onto the raft, and then the whole thing was covered with reed matting and also waterproof with pitch. And the appearance when it was finished would have been maybe quite similar to this. The photo shows reed huts built on artificial islands, which are made by creating a framework of reed bundles and filling them with mud. So of course these islands are not floating, but the Ark would have operated in a similar way, but as a floating platform, and it would look very similar. Basically, it was a floating farm. And you can see that based on the materials and the minimal requirements for of tools, this Ark could indeed have been built in the Neolithic period. So to conclude, we've got strong evidence that Noah's flood was a catastrophic river flood in Mesopotamia. There are several lines of evidence that support a flood around 5,600 BC, consistent with the biblical claim that the flood destroyed all of the known earth at the time. Placing the flood at this early stage of Mesopotamian history is consistent with the biblical belief that all Middle Eastern peoples were descended from Noah. And finally, the Ark could in fact have been built in the Neolithic period if it was a giant raft reinforced with pitch. So thank you for listening, and I'd be happy to try and answer some questions.
Thank you. Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much. It was it's a great talk. It was a surprisingly great talk. So yeah, all appreciating your work that you put for like these discoveries, and it's a very strong theory. I guess we have people from like civil engineering background or like other science and engineering, so they can also, I guess, confess with me at the level of importance of your dating of the flood, and also the feasibility of the Ark. So if we are open for more questions from the people, we appreciate if you guys have any questions.
Sure.
Dr. Mohammadian, do you have any question from your field? Is kind of close on the engineering side.
Engineering side, but not building the Ark. But when I was actually just listening to it, because at the same time I was seeing that Dr. Dickin was referring to the verses from the Bible, and I was trying actually just to remember the verses that we have actually in Qur'an, which basically refers to how the actually just flood started. And to me, actually, just it pretty much actually just we can get support also from Qur'an, and that how it just basically that's how it started. It doesn't actually just refer that to be actually just the entire earth to be covered. That's for sure. But at one point in Qur'an, we have a verse that refers to Noah talking to his son as he's running actually just to seek refuge as he's actually climbing a mountain. And as Dr. Dickin actually showed, within that area, we don't, we don't have mountains or something. So to me, that probably this could have happened actually just closer to the mountainous area of that. So it's just you showed us the area. I don't know, just that's I remember the name of that actually, just those cities, Orkan, or what was actually the name of those cities that you showed actually the evidences from that. So those were actually just pretty much in the southwest side of that, but then we have the mountains on the northern part. So I'm just trying to actually just to compare what we have what the evidences that you showed us with what we have in Qur'an, whether actually just is there any? I know you said that basically there is no mountain, then, but might be actually but be smaller mountains, just some local actually just hills or something. I haven't visited those areas. I've visited part of Iraq actually just closer to Baghdad, and that's pretty much flat. You don't see actually much there. And a little bit south also toward Najaf and Kabul I've seen, and a couple over north it's not, you don't see much there, but on the eastern part it's just all mountainous. So I don't know, anything actually you might have actually just you might have observed that suggests any evidence that this could have happened actually a little bit easter to the region that you were actually just showing us?
Okay, well, the thing is that people have to have a reason for living where they're living, so the attraction of living by the river is the water for irrigation. I mean, we're talking here about obviously, if we're talking about before the flood, we're talking about 6,000 BC. But I mean, this is well after the agricultural revolution. People were, quite expert agriculture, but they were not yet starting to do massive irrigation. So the logical place to farm would be on the riverbanks, which have, basically natural irrigation, groundwater from the river. So I mean, I can't really see that they would have a reason to be over in the mountains of Iran at the time. The other problem would be if Noah or Mesopotamia equivalents, if they were living there and there was going to be a flood, well, there would be no point in building an ark. You would just climb the mountain, So I strongly believe that the mountains referred to are artificial mountains. I mean, these could have been quite large. Like, I mean, they could have been as big as a ziggurat, because, people throughout history have, regarded a mountain as a place to meet with God. And therefore, if there's no natural mountains, building an artificial mountain is an attractive proposition. So to me, that's the most likely explanation. The problem is that the meaning of words is not precise over thousands of years. A mountain and a mound, I mean, they're the same. It's almost the same word. A hill and a mountain in Sumerian are basically the same words. So the specification of the size of a mountain is very poorly constrained. So, I think there's a lot of flexibility in terms of, where did the information come from for these different versions?
I totally agree, and it seems to me actually just the evidence is also there that because his son never actually just gets a chance to seek refuge because he gets drowned, and as he's trying to climb, so it shows that the water level has gone above. That's any mountain, anything that would have been, whether it has been ziggurat, whether it has been a little mountain or just hill, it has been the elevation of the flood has been actually just higher than that. So that's probably that you're right. It couldn't be actually those real mountains actually on the eastern, western part of Iraq.
Yes, I mean, for sure, if there were artificial mounds, people would absolutely have started climbing them in a flood. But then if the level of the water was too high, then that would be the end of them, because there would be nowhere to go. So this seems to be the most reasonable interpretation. Yeah.
Sorry, I don't want to. I see other friends actually have their hands up. So
Awesome. Thank you so much. Dr. Farhad Quddusi from, so Farhad is a physicist from Michigan. So he also have a question. Please.
Hi, hello, Dr. Dickin. Thank you very much for the informative and interesting talk. I kind of play, not the devil advocate, but I was saying that the explanations you give are naturalistic, which is, I mean, maybe more acceptable by modern taste too. So we put the time, we put the flood in the cycle, and then and you look the type of ships can we make. So what was the uniqueness of this flood? Is the size of, because as I felt there was a cycle, the flood can happen maybe around May, so the rivers have the maximum. So, or do we have it for 9? So what was the uniqueness of it? Is the large scale of it, or where he built the ship, which was very far away from the river itself, or just I want to be yeah, that part of it. I mean, so just how you look to it. Just I want to, yeah.
Yeah, well, it's true that flooding has occurred in Mesopotamia throughout history until the modern era when the dams have been built. But the evidence from the paleoclimatic evidence shows quite clearly that this period around 6000 BC was intensely wet. I mean, as I said, it was referred to as a deluge period by geologists who were not remotely making any connection with Noah's flood. So it was a period of intense rainfall events, and the fact that the sapropel is found on in the Mediterranean, for example, shows, for example, that the Nile was undergoing intense flooding events at this period. So it seems clear that it was the most intense period of flooding in Mesopotamia, but also you have to understand that the further back you go, the smaller the scale of human society, and therefore the more relatively overwhelming it is. You know, as time went by and people were building larger and larger structures and, you know, empires and great constructions, then the floods were still devastating, but they wouldn't have had the same like cataclysmic effect that one would have had in the Neolithic. So I think it's a combination of all of these factors. It's an area which is habitually susceptible to flooding. It's an extreme period of rainfall, and it's a level of human society that's relatively undeveloped. They all come together to provide the best fit for a story. The idea being that I mean, for a story to be a faith lesson, it should be credible, a credible event. You know, it has to be, at least speaking biblically, faith can only be based on real events, not on imaginary events, because they're not a real test of faith. And therefore, to be a real demonstration of faith, there has to be a real flood. And so it's logical that we should attempt to determine what the most likely situation was.
I completely agree. All the explanations was nice, and also the flood only must be the basin of Iraq, and also you showed to flooding the whole basin of Iraq, you don't need oceans. So that 50-meter is very nice. But when you look into historical records to 6,000 years before BC, this is the biggest flood of them all. So in those all periods, or something bigger have happened before and after. I mean, so I want to say at least this was the biggest flood has happened in the last 10 years in that area. Is it correct, or has been something that like that scale? I don't. Yeah, I mean, could happen any other flood that kind of size also happen again before, after that, or something before that, or something like?
Okay, well, there are records, yes, there are archaeological records of floods in Mesopotamia. For example, there's one that's quite well documented that partly gave credence to the 2900 BC flood. There was a flood at the city of Kish. It maybe had a deposit of silt that was, I don't know, about a foot thick, but it visibly affected the city. I mean, you could see that it was damaging some of the buildings, but I mean, it didn't markedly affect the what should I say, the development of society. You know, it was just a minor and I mean, doubtless it was devastating, you know, for their convenience, but I mean, they carried on living. I mean, it didn't wipe them all out, you know. So so I mean, yeah, that's a record of a severe flood, but not one that sort of ended civilization, you know, and it didn't require everything to restart again from nothing. Leonard Woolley dug a pit that was 60 foot deep, actually, at the city of Ur, and he found a flood deposit at the bottom, which is arguably was, well, it was called a flood deposit, I should say. Arguably, it was about 4000 BC. But from a modern geological point of view, it's not, most likely it wasn't really actually a flood at all. It's what's called an avulsion event. Avulsion is when a river basically, it's caused by a flood, but the riverbed of the bed of the river moves to a new location, and a new riverbed is established. And so when the river does that, of course, it deposits a new deposit of silt where the new riverbed is. And so it can look like a flood in the geological record, but in fact, it's just a local event. We know that because there's no evidence of a flood of this date at any other place. So avulsion events have happened continually through Mesopotamian history. But we don't see any other, we don't know of any other definite flood records. However, it should be said that, well, it's very expensive to make boreholes. The relevant information requires a borehole, say between 10 and 15 meters deep. And of course, Iraq is not necessarily very, very favorable place to do research at the present day. So we can say that very likely in the future, there'll be more evidence, and maybe we can build up a stronger picture of, you know, putting our finger, you know, as geologists like to say, where's the golden spike that marks exactly in the section where this event would be. I'm confident that we actually will be able to improve the, increase the amount of evidence. But it's going to take years or decades to get a detailed record.
Thank you very much. Just I want to say one point also regarding Dr. Mohammedian's, the previous questioners. You know, in the Qur'an is a hint, the son of Noah says, doesn't come with, this is not in Bible, the whole story of son of Noah, which doesn't come to the, doesn't listen to his father, and doesn't join to the ark, and then he says, I can save myself by swimming, and then hints to some higher land, some higher altitude. My interpretation was that because depending on the local, what you call mountain, maybe have different heights. You know, in Iran, mountains like really high thing, like Damaman or Zakros mountains. But in Iraq, could be a shorter hill, and so I was saying that this could be local hills, or they really didn't think the flood would be that high. And also, still 50 meter is even look, for example, we have a hurricane in California, Florida a few days ago. I mean, 50 meter water rising up still is huge. I mean, even 2 meter, 3 meter is huge. So overall, it's a big one, but I'm very thankful. I think your theory fits everything and natural mechanisms. I think just a miracle was that Noah was aware of it and built a ship somewhere farther away, or anticipatedly at least. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. About so adding to Farhad's comment, the verse, like I'm also saying for the audience, the verse that says that Noah's son says go to a mountain, the term is Jabal, which can be like generally translated mountain, like in Arabic. But the same verse also says uses the term Jabal or mountain one more time for the waves, the tides of that water that is coming up. So it means that kind of the level of those jabals, which are the mountains, were equivalent in size to the tides of the. So the tide cannot be like a mountains of 1 kilometer high like waves. It should be, the tides should be in the order of tens of meters, or so that can make sense, like in defense of that there was not a huge mountain there because they have the same tide level. But my short question is that what is your estimate about the level of how many meters you think the water came up, and was it to the extent that the Mesopotamia, like the water gets connected to Mediterranean Sea or not? Because the one cave that you mentioned was in like the Mediterranean side, that there was, right? Or the cave that you said there was it on the Israel side, or was it in the Mesopotamia?
No, I think you misunderstood what I meant. The cave deposit is not caused by the flood. It's just indicative of the climatic conditions. So in other words, the cave is subject. Yes, okay, I understand what you mean. The cave is flooded by local rainwater. It's part of the same climatic event as Noah's flood, but it's not related in joining up. No. So in other words, it's as the authors said, it's a deluge period when there was basically flooding everywhere. As I said, the Nile flooded in this period, but no, I mean you have to look at it from the point of view of the ancient. Well, I shouldn't really even say author, because obviously the ancient. This was not a written record. This was oral, because there was no writing at 5,600 BC. So this is oral testimony of an eyewitness, Noah, that's passed down for 2,000 plus 3,000 years, basically, until it's written down. But these oral stories can be very accurately passed down, because remember, no TV. So, I mean, these people have got nothing else to talk about. Their oral stories are the central, the central foundations of their lives. So you have to look at it from the point of view of the ancient eyewitness, that he doesn't know of the rest of the world. He only sees what he can see. So it doesn't have to be a giant flood in terms of the depth. Could only be, say, 10 meters even might be adequate to flood everything in Mesopotamia. Or because, I mean, granted that the contour shows up to 50 meters, but the thing is, it doesn't require land to be absolutely 100% totally flat for water to pond, even very, very small changes in elevation, if they're hundreds of kilometers apart, that the water will not be completely flat. It will be there'll be minor bridges or whatever that hold water into different areas for different periods of time, you know. So what I'm saying is we don't need 50 meters of water to flood Mesopotamia. Probably 10 meters would be completely devastating. I'm talking about 10 meters that lasted for a year until it drained away. It will be completely devastating, because if you lived in the middle of the plain where the river is, well, there's nothing for a year. So you would not see land for a year.
Yeah. Also, thank you. Just minor comment and go back to questions of others, that the source of this flood, I guess, generally could be understood as the like a massive rain, but for the maybe the rivers, I guess so. But I guess both the Bible and the Quran emphasize both like rain, and also some like the Quran uses the word tanur, which is some like sources from like the terrestrial, like earthly sources of water sprouting up, and also so there was two-sided kind of accumulation of water.
Yeah, okay, that's a good point. Well, there's two things that could be relevant here. I mean, firstly, we've got the sea itself, you know. So as I said, because this period is exactly the period when sea level for the first time has impinged onto the plain. So for the first time, the sea it's not the cause of a flood, but it's going to prevent the flood from draining away. So I mean, I mean, for example, if there was a gale of wind, you can get a storm surge. So the sea level might have gone up, you know, even if it wasn't the only cause of the flood. It could certainly exacerbate the flood. So that's one factor. The other factor is this is an earthquake zone. Mesopotamia is adjacent to the Iranian mountains. It's actually what geologists call a continental subduction zone. So what it means is that the mountains are rising and Mesopotamia is sinking, and there are significant earthquakes along the northern side of Mesopotamia. There have been records of at least magnitude 5 or 6 earthquakes. So, for example, it's very possible that earthquake events could have coincided. I mean, what I should say is you have to understand that partly what makes the flood devastating is the rapidity of the process. So you've got huge discharge from the mountains in Turkey. So the rivers are at their peak anyway, and then you've got a local deluge event, a local massive rainfall event. So you get the bursting of the riverbanks and very, very sudden flooding of land. If you have an earthquake at the same time, then what's going to happen is you're going to get land subsidence, and therefore suddenly land is going to be it's going to subside, and therefore any flood water is going to like instantly flood an area which otherwise might have taken longer to flood, you know. So you can combine all of these natural processes, but if they all occur simultaneously, it's like, as I said, the perfect storm. And I mean, that's actually very biblical. You know, there are several miracles in the Bible which are not actually they're not outside of natural. They're not outside the course of natural events, but the miracle is in the timing. You know, for example, you probably know the story of Joshua crossing the river Jordan to invade Canaan. And basically they stepped into the priests stepped into the river, and as soon as they did that, the river stopped flowing because, and I think it even says in the text, it says there was a landslide of 10 miles upstream or something that cut off the river. So it's the timing of an event which makes it a miracle. So you can have a natural event, and you can have confluence of sources of causes, which the coincidence of causes, when these all come together, you know, and also with Noah, who's been told to do this ahead of time, then the overall result is what you might call a miracle or you know, an act of faith. So that's what I would say. Yes, it's a combination of factors.
Yeah, thank you so much. One last minor question: where this ark landed in your idea? I guess in the sense, like at least in the Shia Islamic, not the whole Islamic, but in the Shia sources, it said that where the Noah was living was next to the today's city of Najaf, southern Iraq, but they were landing on it is like on the Ararat or Mount Judy, which was apparently in the northern Iraq. So it should be like few tens of meters up, so that the ark should go northward toward to some mountainous areas. Or you think the landing was also local?
Yeah, well, it's, you know, that like precise pinpointing of places this long ago, you know, it's very unreliable as to say this is exactly where the ark landed. It doesn't, you know. Yes, I mean, the Christian belief is that the ark landed on Mount Ararat. Well, I mean, that's definitely impossible. I mean, Mount Ararat in Turkey, you know, that's definitely not possible. But then again, there's another place called Arata, which sounds very much like Ararat. So it's very possible that two places with very similar names have got muddled up.
Yeah.
And as you said, other sources say that the ark landed in the southern Iranian mountains, which is much more likely. So if there was a wind, you know, it's quite possible that the ark got blown towards the mountains and did land somewhere over on those mountains. And exactly where it landed, you know, really, who would know? Who could? As I said, it's 3,000 years before it's written down. So I think that's the least, yeah, probably the least problematical. Well, I would say one more thing in that connection, though. I mean, the important thing in the story, or at least an important part of the story, is the idea that the flood went down. So in other words, the flood had an end. This is part of the evidence that this is a river flood. You may know that some guys who are geophysicists argued that the flood was in the Black Sea. They said, you know, where the Black Sea suddenly filled with water when sea level rose, and that this gave rise to the flood story. Well, this is impossible because the Black Sea never went back down again, you know. So the idea of the flood increasing and then drying up again and disappearing, that's an important part of the story. So again, it confirms that the flood was in Mesopotamia. And yes, I think there's a few, you know, issues, but I don't think they're fatal issues for the overall model.
Yeah. Just one comment about the Mount Ararat. Apparently, like before, the whole mountains were the northern mountains of the Iraq and the southeast, like Turkey, was called Mount Ararat. But gradually, just the Mount Ararat, that particular mountain called. So that maybe you can think of it in a more expanded way. The mountains on the southern part of Iraq used to be like the mountainous area of like the Ararat, like in the Greek sources. So that Mount Judy or like that, the north can be to some, by Judy I mean like northern Mosul, like the Nineveh, Mosul, upward, a little north of that, which is in today's Iraq, not Turkey. Still, that was apparently one candidate even pre-Islamic time of the Christians of Middle East. They had argued, this is Mount Ararat or this Mount Judy. There was like a dichotomy at the time. I was doing some study on that. But like the Qur'an takes the Mount Judy, mentions it specifically versus the Ararat, which is very higher land. But this is all just raising this for the possibilities. Okay, so we have two more questions. One from Layli Zigbari. If you are still there.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Dickens, for your thoughtful and very impressive theory that you presented. I have a question, but actually I think that in the Q&A section you already touched upon, but still, I have this question that I'm wondering if you have ever come across any linguistic or communicative signs as an, because you mentioned several lines of the evidence to support the estimate age of the Ark. So I'm just wondering that have you ever come across any linguistic or communicative signs just to document and support your evidence for the estimate age of the Ark? Or if it is not a written communication, just if it is not a spoken communication, any written communication system like the pictographic or hieroglyphic, are they also included in your theory?
Okay, well, the oldest actual literature, the oldest literary account of the flood is in the early second millennium, which is to say around 1700 BC. So I mean, like obviously that's 4,000 years essentially after the most likely time of the flood. I mean, that's, you know, that's an extremely long period of time. We don't actually have any actual definitive account of the flood from, I mean, an actual text that's older than that. However, the oldest we can push it is we can say that there's part of there's a series of stories about the semi-legendary king called Gilgamesh, and he lived around, thought to have lived around 2600, 2700 BC, and there is a series of, there's this like an epic cycle attached to him, and one of these stories is called the Death of Gilgamesh, and it's important because it links the Gilgamesh cycle to the flood cycle, because in this account of the death of Gilgamesh, the gods say something like, Gilgamesh will have to die. Gilgamesh was regarded as a demigod, so therefore he might have expected immortality, but the gods decreed that he would have to die because they had decided that no one else except for the flood hero would ever be given immortality, which is to say that the flood stories claim that the flood hero was given immortality. I mean, the Mesopotamian versions, right? The Atrahasis epic. Atrahasis means extra wise, but he's also called Uternapishtim, which means he who saw life or something like that. So anyway, traditionally the flood hero was given immortality, but Gilgamesh was not going to receive it. So therefore, the fact that this is discussed in the Gilgamesh cycle kind of links the flood story with Gilgamesh, and therefore, and Gilgamesh is attested in inscriptions as early as 2600 BC. So that's pretty early. I mean, this is the very, very earliest Sumerian literature is at 2600 BC. So because we can link Gilgamesh, the flood, with Gilgamesh, and because we can show inscriptional evidence for Gilgamesh at 2600 BC, that's as strong as you're going to get in terms of, you know, verifying that there was a flood. It doesn't say anything about the time of the flood, other than the fact that the flood was regarded as the very fact that the flood hero was given immortality, whereas Gilgamesh was not. That in itself is evidence that it was a long time ago, because the being given immortality by the gods is kind of like a mark of a very ancient sort of trope. I mean, it's you know, it's like the golden age of the Greeks. Nothing like that happens nowadays, would be the kind of attitude. And therefore, it's another signifier that they regarded the flood as very ancient, even relative to Gilgamesh. So, that's the best kind of literary case we can put together, just to say, yeah, they recognize that there was an epic flood that was a very long time ago, long before modern history, which is to say the third millennium. So yeah, that's about, I think, as far as we could take it.
Thank you so much. I'm mostly concerned not with the literacy text, but with the way that maybe the people, for example, the people of Noah at that time communicated.
Oh, well.
So I'm just wondering that if you found in the evidence any, for example, pictographs or any hieroglyphics, for example, in the wall, or any other way that you were investigating this experiment.
Well, the oldest writing is 3400 BC. It doesn't really impinge directly. Doesn't really have show any relevant light illumination on the flood, I would say. I mean, in terms of linguistics rather than writing, there's a lot of recent evidence about the origins of human languages and connecting language groups together. The new evidence shows that the Semitic language is more recent than has generally been expected, and that Semitic peoples didn't even basically appear until after the time of the flood. So that's interesting, because the inhabitants of ancient Mesopotamia were the Sumerians. Now, the Sumerians speak, interestingly, Sumerians speak their language can be reconstructed from bilingual tablets, and their pronunciation can be approximately recovered, and it's a language isolate. It's been argued to be remotely connected with so-called Turkic language group, which is an ancient form of Turkish, basically, and also found in southern Russia and in the Caucasus and so on. So it's conceivable that the Sumerians could be linguistically descended from people from the Caucasus. The argument would be, well, the Sumerians are basically the descendants of Noah, and they are the survivors of the flood. And so the fact that Sumerian is a language isolate, in a sense, is quite consistent with the flood story. It means all their ancestors were washed away, and that's all that's left. And then 1,000 or 2,000 years after that, then the Semitic peoples arrive in Mesopotamia, and then that's the origin of the Tower of Babel story. But that's for another day. It is another very interesting historical event, historical faith event, the story of the Tower of Babel. But we haven't got time to talk about it now.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Maybe we should invite you one more time to talk about that subject too. So, Saeed Ashrafinia, please.
Hello, Dr. Dickin. Thank you very much for your very interesting talk. I had 3 questions. The first 2 ones that were really relevant to your talk has been already asked by the previous attendees about the localization of the flood of where Prophet Noah was living, and also about what happened to the people afterwards. So it just leaves me with my third question, which is a little bit pivot from your entire discussion. My question comes from the fact that from your interest in finding scientific relevance for previous prophets. Another prophet that that's been shared between Abrahamic religions is Prophet Jonah, and the story that he went to inside a giant fish mouth, and he was there living for a while. So I was wondering, in your research, have you encountered any scientific studies or research about that? Has anybody looked into the fact that whether a human being can be eaten by a giant fish, like a sperm whale or something in that size? I would appreciate your comment.
Yes, no, that's actually extremely interesting. Well, I can't give you any physiological answer about that. No, I don't know anything about the survivability per se of that event, let's call it. But there is some very important, what should I call it, iconographical evidence, which is to say, so I mean, you know, obviously the story of is that after, well, cutting to the end of the story, after Noah had been eaten by the fish, he was spewed out on the beach, and then he went to Nineveh and he preached to the Ninevites, and they all repented with like alarming or kind of unbelievable sincerity, let's say, right? In other words, his preaching was apparently unexpectedly effective. And the question is, well, why were the Ninevites so smitten, if you like, by the story? Well, there's a very good answer for that. And the answer is that iconographical evidence, which is to say wall murals, show that the Ninevites believed in what you might call a legend called the fish man. And in fact, there's numerous depictions of the fish man. It's not just one or two. There's probably more than a dozen depictions of the fish man. The fish man was basically it's a mythological, what do I call him, entity, let's just say, like part fish and part man, who was supposedly emerged from the sea and was like a kind of sage, arguably a kind of sort of a supernatural sage who educated mankind in the arts of civilization. That's roughly what the legend says. And in these depictions, he's sometimes shown as like a mermaid, well, like a mermaid, only a man. He's sometimes shown as like a priest wearing a sort of raincoat that's in the shape of a fish. It's a bit bizarre, but anyway, you could find them on the internet. But anyway, the important point is that this idea of the fish man was one of the most revered legends of the Ninevites. So when a man appears out of a fish, it's like their founding father came back to them. So I've actually written about this in my book, my commentary on Genesis. I've tried to find an analogy, and the best analogy I could find was that Abraham Lincoln came back from the dead, and he got a train to Washington and preached that the inhabitants of Washington should repent. Well, this would have a pretty dramatic effect, you know, if Abraham Lincoln essentially rose from the dead and arrived in Washington. So I think the Americans, the inhabitants of Washington, would definitely repent. And so the important thing about this is that it ties together the demonstrated beliefs of the Ninevites with the biblical account of Jonah. It's actually a very powerful supporting evidence that even though the story of Jonah seems unbelievable, that it was actually a real event. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. And of course, oh, I should have just said that the name of, in the Greek translation of the account of the fish man, is called Oannes. So it's quite clearly the same name as Jonah. In fact, Jonah may even be named after the Mesopotamian Oannes, and so it's basically all tied together. It's a very important story, and of course, it's also worth mentioning that Jesus actually referred to Jonah as the most important sign for his own resurrection. You know, he said at one point, and the only sign that you will receive is the sign of Jonah. So the story of Jonah is actually far more important than is generally recognized. Yeah, good question. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. It seems like another interesting topic for another interesting talk. And can you please spell Oannes? I just put the word in Google. It doesn't seem to recognize.
Oannes.
Oh, got it. Okay. Thank you.
It's in the back. Well, I mean, yes, the most detailed account is in what should I call it? Is in a writing called the Babyloniarca. Yeah, if you want to take another couple of minutes, the Babyloniarca of Berossus was actually a recitation of Mesopotamian mythology, which was written in Greek for the Greeks. It's a what do you call it? It's a Hellenistic period work which attempts to present the Mesopotamian worldview to the Greeks. It was markedly unsuccessful in the sense that the Greeks found it to be fantastical. For example, you know, the one of the features of the king list, which I didn't mention, is the fantastically long lifetimes of the early kings. And this is also recorded in the Babyloniarca, and the Greeks didn't like this. You know, this is ridiculous. People can't live for 30,000 years, and therefore we're not interested. So, in fact, the original was lost, and the only source of it is the fact that early Christian authors quoted it verbatim in great chunks. And most of those early sources are lost also, but then they were in turn quoted by other sources. So by a long daisy chain of these sources, the original Babyloniarca has been kind of reconstructed. And it gives the story of Oannes, the fishman. And the interesting thing is that when the Babyloniarca is actually compared with various pieces of Mesopotamian literature, well, like the King List, it turns out to be incredibly accurate. So even though it's an excerpt of a lost work, it turns out that these excerpts seem to be very accurately copied. And again, it's another important source, even though it's relatively late because it's Hellenistic. But yeah, you should be able to find the Babyloniarca for sure on the internet.
So I had one question before Said's next question because it's relevant. Do you think is there like the let's say Nineveh's like myth was first, and like like the biblically the Jonah appeared, or the Jonah's appearance ended up to become like a cultural myth for the centuries after by the people of Nineveh? I think which one was first happening? So the idea of believing in a fisherman sage was first, or it was kind of introduced to them after the incident of like Jonah?
Okay, I'm pretty certain that the fishman that there are old enough depictions to show that he preceded the story of Jonah. Of course, the story of Jonah itself is kind of difficult to date, but yeah, I believe that probably depictions of the fishman go back to 600 or 700 BC. So I think they definitely would predate Jonah. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
The book, yeah, the biblical.
And I just wanted to add the Oannes that you said, it's actually closer to the Arabic word for Jonah, which is Yunus. So in Arabic, Jonah is called Yunus, and we say the same in Persian, in Farsi. And it's interesting that Oannes is pretty much similar, very similar to Yunus. Yeah, thank you.
No, I
Thank you.
agree. I mean, all of these names got corrupted when they got translated into Greek. So yes, that's very, very very reasonable. Yes, yeah, for sure. So it does. There's a lot of connections here together. In fact, yes, which have not been fully explored. I mean, this connection between Oannes and Jonah is not widely known. Certainly not amongst Christians. It's not widely known. Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting, very interesting. So thank any other questions from audience? I guess we made you tired tonight. It was long. So thank you so much, Dr. Dickin, for accepting our invitation, and hopefully we sometime in the future will benefit from your knowledge and one of your other researches. And again, in introduction, I mentioned people can look up. There are all 4 of like biblical studies books of the Alan is available in Amazon. So on Amazon you can order them. They're all, most of them are the kind of so that's on the subject of science and religion, science and Bible, which is very important for, of course, Islamic studies and Quranic studies as well. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed doing it. So it's yeah, it's been fun, and thanks for all your questions, which as you gathered, it set off some other ideas as well, which were even beyond what we started with the flood. So yes, thank you. It's good.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye then. Hope to see you again sometime.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.